All right, we are back with Daniela, and Daniela is back from vacation. Portugal, how was it?
Portugal, it was so good. It was so good. Until the way back, our flight got canceled because of the storm, and then it became, the 36-hour saga home, um, which wasn't too fun, but super amazing. Interestingly enough, my daughter today told me, she's like, I'm still getting used to everyone everywhere speaking English, which is, and I said to her, I was like, imagine that, but you're 14 and you've never experienced everyone around you speaking English, which is, in Uncultured, one of the things I describe about America is like it felt so loud because just like
Mhm.
everyone was speaking English. And even though I understand Portuguese, it's a lot easier for me to like shut it out
Now,
because it's
now
not
there
my
were
first language.
yeah, there were a couple of things that you shared on social media that I want to talk about. It may come up in our conversation today. We're talking about us versus them mentality as one of the characteristics that you've developed to identify cults and high control groups. So I want to know about tuna on pizza, and I want to know about the nude beach experience.
Yeah, let's do it. So I just got back from Portugal, which was just, it's interesting because it was just my family vacation, but also Portugal is one of my favorite places, in part because I speak Portuguese, in part because it's just a lovely, lovely place. But I describe Portugal as the trip that like I went with the wrong person. And I even write about this in my video book, Un-American, which I'll link below. 6 hours of me reading second memoir to you while knitting. Um, but this time I got to go back with my beautiful family. And, I'm in this moment where a lot of deconstruction stuff is starting to come full circle for me. And, this fits with my model of deconstruction, which is like you have the crack in the brainwashing, you physically, you mentally leave. Then you have a decade, which starts when you start it, of deconstruction and
Right.
understanding what impacts being in a cult had on your identity. And then you go into the third of, moving forward with no models. And let me tell you, when I got to go back with my like lovely family, it felt so nice. It felt so healing. Today, my 8-year-old actually was getting a little mad at my husband because he's such an amazing dad and he's so respectful to women and he's such best friends with mommy. And do you want me to never find a partner, dad? It's pretty nice, to be like, hey, we done good. We are at least striving to be models that she wants to emulate, rather than, some of us that are doing anything but the way we were raised. So Portugal was really cool. Tuna pizza is one of my favorites. Now, I have to say, to start off with, I grew up in Brazil where canned fish is a big deal. For example, they'll
Okay.
have it in a gas station store. And it was also one of the special foods in the cult. And so I've always loved canned tuna and sardines and found out that Americans do not. And I currently share my tuna with the toy poodle, and my husband and daughter laugh at me for eating the dog food. But then when I went to Germany in college, they had tuna on pizza. And it's strange to me that Americans get so weirded out by that because anchovies, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
But
true.
I grew up also with this kind of, I think, boomer or maybe even depression era thing of like cream tuna on spaghetti, for example. So tuna in an Alfredo sauce, essentially. And tuna pizza to me is that,
Okay.
is also very similar to a tuna melt. But I do have fun, like really tripping out Americans with my love of tuna on pizza and sardines in literally any form.
Yeah, I was tripping out just a little bit when you mentioned that. And the second experience that you had that I want to talk about goes along with our conversation today about us versus them mentality. This idea of group norms and how we
Yes.
conform to the people that are around us. And you were talking about that experience in connection with the nude beach that your family visited.
Yes, I'm so glad you brought this in. Okay, so again, part of my whole theory of raising children, so I was raised in hypersexuality. We never didn't know what sex was. And then I come to America and I learn about like American purity culture that feels like equally as icky and I think equally leads to abuse. Um, and even before I had a child, I always joke that one of the first things I said to my husband was, "Hi, I'm Daniela. I was raised in South America and I like to be naked in public." Um, but I always say it's one of my favorite ways to explain group norms to people. It's excellent, I think, for all kinds of things, right? Like understanding that the human body is not inherently sexualized in every situation. Um, Understanding like better body image, all that kind of stuff. It's, conversations are so interesting when people are not wearing clothes because the same rules of society apply. Like, don't be a creep still
Right.
applies, right? But clothes are really two things, right? They are armor and they are signaling gear. And when you don't have either of those two things, like conversations are just different. For example, nobody walks up to you at a nudist resort and is like, "What do you do for a living?" Like, that's not the first question that comes up. People just have much more, I don't know how to explain it, like organic, enjoying life conversations. And so I'm a big fan. And every time we are out of the US, we make a point to go to nudist beach and go with our child and expose her to different ways of life. But I
What?
also love naked beaches because of group norms. So if you go to a nude beach, no matter how you feel about public nudity or how like nervous that idea might make you feel, if you
Mhm.
have clothes on, you'll be the one who feels out of place. I also kind of compare it to like for a like tall white dude walking into a pedicure place at 2 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon. And like that moment when all of the women, all 20 women in there, clients and people working, like stop and look at you, you're going to understand a little bit of how I felt walking through the cafeteria in the military as like one of the only women. So like
So I.
when you feel out of place, it
Uh
is an
huh.
incredibly uncomfortable situation. And what our psyche wants to do with that is make that feeling stop. And so we conform,
Mhm.
hence group norms.
And so, speaking of group norms, obviously, your husband coming from a different experience than what you came from, I imagine how I would feel the first time going into the situation. Obviously, I would feel self conscious if I walked into a nude beach fully clothed. But before I enter the nude beach, I would feel a lot of anxiety about doing this because we've been conditioned. And again, this goes to group norms and cultural behavior here in the
Mm-hmm.
United States. We've been
Mm-hmm.
conditioned that you don't go out in public without clothes on.
Yes. So there's a lot of interesting things in there too, especially when you're talking about like difference of experience. So I
Mm-hmm.
appreciate having this conversation with men because let's just face it, one of the things men are worried about public nudity is that they will be sized up because of their sexual organs. And baby, women are sized up because of their sexual organs every day, right? One
Mm-hmm.
of the sexual organs that men are the most interested in getting a look at, a lot about it even when we are clothed.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of just, I'm like, just kind of suck it up. But I also think it's like you feel nervous before any new
True.
activity, before exposure to
Absolutely.
anything. And I will say for all the people that are feeling uncomfortable, like my husband chose when he was ready to get
Sure.
involved. My kid still gets to choose. Like she doesn't have to be naked. And every time she thinks she's not going to. And then she sees everyone else and she's like, "Frolic!" Um, and I honestly do believe like there is nothing more pure, like the true version of pure, than like watching a kid and their dad nakedly frolicking at the beach and having that be joyful and human and nothing at all sexual about it because children aren't sexual and any sexualizing done. The adult is the problem.
Right. And I think this introduction sets up our conversation today beautifully because I would imagine that, like me, even having this conversation with you, right? I feel a tinge of being uncomfortable, right? Because I've never experienced that. And I imagine some of our viewers and some of our listeners may feel a bit uncomfortable about us even talking about this in a public setting. And that's because we are a part of a culture, and some of us have emerged, as I did, from religious groups, religious cults that were very hyper aware of anyone's sexuality or the body. They were all about policing the body, and so we became very self conscious about how we appear to others, and what we wear, what we don't wear, even to the point that having a conversation like you and I just had about an experience that you had would have been frowned upon because it did not conform to those particular group norms. So, we're going to talk about
100%.
us versus them mentality and how that's used to control people.
Yeah. And I always say it's important to know your cult families, and the
Mhm.
US comes from a cult called the Puritans, right? Like they
Right.
absolutely fit every, definition of a cult that we would use today. And in my opinion, the Puritans going to America, this is going to piss a lot of people off, doesn't actually have that much different from Jim Jones taking his people to Guyana, right? Or David Berg taking his people all around the world in The Children of God. Um, and, we think about America as like the land of opportunity for everyone. But America was also a land that a bunch of people went to when they couldn't stay in their countries anymore because of their extreme beliefs. And
Right.
so, the Puritans were also a belief system that just basically demonized fun, right? Like if it's fun, it's bad.
Hmm.
And we have so many. I had this argument with my first boss on during my first deployment, and he was trying to say that blue laws, alcohol laws in states aren't based religiously. And I'm like, you're literally in Texas, you're not allowed to buy beer until 11 o'clock in the morning on Sunday because how dare you buy beer during the hours of God's house?
Right. Yeah, and so many of our laws, so many of our customs, so many of our traditions are steeped in that puritanical tradition, the Victorian era morals that we inherited, and it becomes a part of our binary thinking. And you reference
Yep.
this in the us versus them mentality. And I was thinking about it today. So much of what we experience here in the United States is binary, it's either or. And
Mm-hmm.
especially when you look at our politics, when you look at our religious practices, when you look at our traditions, when you look at how people typically define what it means to be an American and what we label as un American, there's not a lot of nuance involved. And
Right.
it's very black and white. And sometimes, right, given the problematic history of our nation, it's been literally black
Yeah.
and white.
And, let me tell you, I say to this, right? There's a reason the book I'm writing is called The Culting of America. And even this 10-part list that we are so painstakingly talking through in all of these episodes, there's one group of people that looks at this list and says, well, that applies to every group. And that group is Americans.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, yes, like America is binary, right? It is isolationist. For so much of our history, you just couldn't get to America. It's another reason I think that New Zealand and Australia have so many cults because they're just isolated from most of the rest of the world. It just takes more work to get there. Um, and then of course in America, like, right, black and white, like you said, literally with races, right?
Mm-hmm.
And with we are right, they are wrong. Um, and not for nothing with Disney, villain, the whole concept of villain versus hero, good, bad, right? And we've
Right.
exported that throughout the world. And I love every time there's a new like villain movie, like the Cruella movie or the Maleficent movies, which like give you this much more nuanced backstory I just listened to there's this genre of fiction that I love that I call like Greek mythology retold by feminists. And this book called Hera, where, Hera is Zeus's crazy wife, and it tells her story. Like, why is she crazy? Oh, because her husband is a raping, murdering, cheating bastard. And she has every reason to be angry at him. But, it's not like that, right? It's black and white. And I was even having this discussion today with someone about the crunchy to cult pipeline, right? Which is like uber health freak, health food,
Mhm.
exercise, all of that, like into alt-right extremism that we are seeing right now. And just so people don't think this is my bias, straight out of the GW program on counterterrorism, every terrorist threat in the world right now comes from a fundamentalist mindset. Even the ones who tried to blow up Taylor Swift. So, I think that this kind of stuff, when you were, bringing us back to food, I used to like literally joke, but with deeper meaning my whole time in the army that like one day I'm going to write an essay called "You're So Un-American, You Don't Like Hamburgers." Because that's people tell me this based on my food choices because I like Ethiopian food more than hamburgers. How dare I be an American? Um,
Yeah, and all of that comes into play. And being raised in a religious cult as um, I was reminiscing today, and I was thinking about how much of this binary thinking is taught to us very early on, and it's from certain interpretations of the Bible, and this may be true for other religious groups as well, based upon whatever they deem to be their sacred text. But if you think about all of those Bible stories that we were told, and it makes me cringe sometimes to think that we were told this as little children, that the entire world was bad, but there was this one guy, Noah, he was good, everyone else was evil. So God drowned all of the evil people and saved this one good guy, Noah. Which, if you read the Bible closely, that's not even how the story really goes, but that's how we were told the story in those binary terms. It's either you choose God or you choose Satan, and there's no in between. There's no nuance, and you either go with God or you're going to hell, and God's going to be angry with you and kill all of you.
yes. I even had this conversation with someone in my family about gender. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And she's going, I know what you think, but I can tell you from the age my son could walk about and say a few words and choose his own toys, he had a preference for trucks and cars and boy things. And I'm here going like, you don't think you had an influence on your son for the first year of his life? Like that's what you're
Right.
saying,
Yeah,
you know?
he chose
I
trucks and
mean,
boy things because that's what he had to play with, right?
right. The second we found out we were having a girl, my husband was like, okay, her nursery theme is pink helicopters.
Yep.
And let me tell you, he enjoyed walking into toy stores and going, can you please point me to your pink helicopters?
I love it.
And we eventually staged like an entire air assault of cartoon pink helicopters with overhead support of a big military aircraft
Nice.
flying over her crib. It was cute. We spent as much time on that as we've spent on planning actual military air assaults in combat. Speaking of
Yeah,
us versus them,
yeah,
um,
and that's what a lot of
and
people don't realize is that all of this conditioning, it happens way before we're born. And so, do people act in certain ways? Do they conform to certain gender norms? Yes, because that's the world that we prepared for them to enter. And if you
exactly.
only have exposure to that particular world, then yes, you're going to have some conformity to the expectations of that culture and of that world.
Yes, exactly, right? And this is, kind of where I was going with the crunchy thing was like black and white rules are that. Black and white rules exist for the purpose of telling us that if we do something and we adhere to it, things will work out all right. right? And
Hmm.
also there's that subtle undertone, which we always have in cults, of we're better people than people that don't observe this. Right. Which is why I
Right.
say cults always use purity requirements. And that's not just sexual purity that we might think of. It's I don't put X in my body, in my hair, in my mind. I don't listen to this music. I don't drink. I don't do drugs. Not that I'm saying you have to drink or do drugs to not be in a cult, but it is a black and white rule, right? This, any of you that as soon as you hear someone's a vegan, just think, oh, save me, right? Like that feeling of superiority that we can't quite nail down, right? It's the black and whiteness is what makes us feel safe, right? And from hence comes the us versus them. And honestly, when people ask me, like, as humans, can we even get past it? My answer as a sociologist is I don't know. Like, I kind of think that the human disease is to stack rank ourselves and then we kill the ones at the bottom. And long before I educated myself on trans issues and long before I had a member of my family come out as a trans person, I I just knew when it was all supposedly about girls' sports, I was just like, I get it. I get it. I get what you're saying that like these women train all their lives and then they get beat by someone with more. But I was like, but as humans, as soon as we start making rules and laws to keep people out of something, legislation or regulation, that always leads to us like treating them worse and ultimately, if left to its extreme form, killing them. And
And that's
I know I don't want
yeah,
to be a part of that. You know, it's very,
and
very interesting that when a group of people cannot do something, you don't have to make legislation or regulation to keep them from doing it. You know, I had no rules in my house that my husband could not breastfeed the baby. Um, because I didn't think he was going to do a good job. And it's like, it was even so frustrating, like serving in the military during a time of gender segregation. And or like being a woman when they thought that if we ran marathons, our uteruses were going to fall out. And it's so interesting, like being a woman in the military, knowing that, of course, you can do that thing that they're doing, and being told that, like, you are incapable of doing it. And I
when you
think
talk
that was
about that,
exactly us
yeah,
versus them mentality as well. The military is the
yeah.
last standing boys club, and we're not letting it go. Which, by the way, you gave me the opportunity to highlight in my own book today. And I'm not going to read that part yet, but I do have a chapter in my book called Us versus Them, and it is in the Army section. And I am deployed, and you might think, as I intended you to, that this chapter is going to be about war, about Americans versus terrorists, right? What we were told, war on terror. But this chapter is actually us versus them, women soldiers, male soldiers, and how that dynamic works out.
And when you talk about that particular example with women in particular, it makes me think of that famous essay that was written somewhere around 1850 or so by John Stuart Mill, The Subjugation of Women. And he talks about the fact, and he was obviously ahead of his time as far as feminism goes, but he talks about this idea that we don't know what women are capable of because they've never been given the opportunity in our culture. And that's a powerful essay. I encourage everyone to read it.
If you're not watching us on video, I'm just here celebrating because I've never heard a straight man bring this up. And this is one of my favorite quotes of all time. She talks about it in the book Educated as well. So
Yeah.
interestingly, for a man being ahead of his time, John Stuart Mill has been called the last man who knew everything. Because
Mm.
basically up until that point, you still could have read all the books in existence, I guess. Um,
Wow.
and then like that is no longer possible, no matter how much little Daniela dreamed of a house where she could read all the books in the world. Um, but yeah, I love this idea that like, and this is what I'm seeing in like the Gen Alpha is like, this is the first generation of girls being raised, not being hit and not being told who they can be, what they can do, what they can think, and oh my God, fingers crossed, they're going to be doing it under the first woman president. Um, and, it's so interesting to be like living through these interesting times, right? Because like we don't
Absolutely.
even know what's going to change.
Right.
And I have this theory, honestly, and I know this might offend you, but I think if we really looked at it, women would be better at doing most things than men because we know the male way to do it, right? It has been out there. She has 46 models of how to be a president as a man, but she is
Hmm.
writing the book on how to do it as a woman. And this is like my story in Uncultured, where we get to the village and the men notice that the sand looks funny, which I never would have
Hmm.
noticed, which was definitely an indicator. They noticed that we were being shoved into one route, which is another sign of danger. And I noticed that there were no children. And together we put that together. But we wouldn't have even known kind of, what
Right.
to look at. Another story that I love is that Sarah Blakely of Spanx. So she was wondering, she was like, why is hosiery so horrible? Like, why has nobody made a better version of it? She set out to do just that. And she could not get anyone to build her prototype because they were all men answering the question of why hosiery sits so bad. But this man, Dan, I love that for us Dans, came back to her and said, okay, I've changed my mind. I'm going to make it for you. And she said, what changed your mind? And he said, I have a wife and 3 adult daughters, and I told them about your product, and they all promised to leave me if I didn't create your product. And, he didn't have the perspective to realize.
Right.
And Sarah Blakely remains one of the few people who has built a unicorn company worth $1 billion or more without outside investment because men could not see her vision. But Oprah could.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons that I'm excited and hopeful about a Kamala Harris administration. I wrote recently in a piece that I write for Faith on View. It's a Christian blog spot, but I write from my perspective, and I wholeheartedly endorsed Kamala Harris because one of the reasons is it's a cultural breakthrough, right? We don't know what kind of leadership women are capable of exhibiting at the highest level, at the highest office, because they've never had the opportunity to do so in our past. So this
Yeah, and Scott,
breakthrough,
I thought your video about Kamala Harris was so good. And listeners, please follow Scott on TikTok. He is one of the men that is truly doing the work. Um, so great to see that.
well, thank you, and it's true, right? As soon as she announced her bid for the presidency, here comes all of the predictable white mediocre men who don't have an ounce of accomplishment compared to her,
Yeah.
criticizing her, and that's what we see from the other side now. They can't come
So,
up with anything of substance, and it's all about
right.
who she is.
Right. And also, but nobody predicted the response was going to be this big toward her either, right? Because I don't think
Hmm.
all of the white men in power understood how everyone other than straight white men, for the first time, is seeing themselves represented in some way in this one person and is feeling so energized, and they even talk about this in entrepreneurship, which is cultiness in itself, but like the last blue ocean strategies, the thing that nobody's done before is making things for marginalized groups because it
Hmm.
just hasn't been done. And as I say in Uncultured, like women are not scaled down men. I love this argument that like women are worse at shooting than men are. Well, yeah, rifles are made for you to be 6 feet tall. Maybe if we had rifles, maybe if I had a rifle that was made for me to be 5'5", and yes, I know the buttstock is adjustable, people. I was a captain in the Army. They're still made for people to be on average 6 feet tall. And, one of the things I say, and this is actually in my 10-point plan on how to stop rape culture that I've briefed to 12 NATO countries, is give us armor, equipment, uniforms, and weapons in equipment, like in our size, like made for women. our body ratios are different. One of the things interesting, we're the only military, I believe, to not have gendered fatigues. And every
Wow.
time we bring it up, they're like, why are you trying to be sexy in uniform? We understand this already for dress uniform in the military. So when you're wearing that, ubiquitous military uniform, dress uniform that all the branches have, the men's stack of medals and all the flashy stuff that go up here, it is based on your pockets. So it is the same for every man, which also gives you the very convenient option of just dropping it off at dry cleaning and they will reconstruct it for you. For women, it's literally based on our breasts. It is because we know that for every woman, it's going to be different. Meanwhile, in fatigues, many a large chested woman name tape is unreadable because they have not thought about this kind of stuff. And I talk about this also in Uncultured, where I was one of the first women on deliberate ground combat teams, and we did not have a vest that would have worked for us because everyone's saying like, oh, does it stop a bullet? Yes. Well, that's not gendered. But in actuality, like the question is it going to keep the same people behind it alive? And the answer to that was no, because ironically, they had underestimated breasts.
Well, and it goes to combat effectiveness, doesn't it? A very practical consideration. Whether women are in a combat situation like you were, or in a support position for combat troops, if they are in clothing, fatigues, and armor that is fitted to their body, they're going to be far more effective than if they're wearing something that was constructed for men.
Yeah. And, this goes into things we've talked about in previous episodes, like appearance control. And I talked about
Hmm.
where, like, the US Army is made for you to be 6'2", blonde, blue eyed, with a jaw that can cut glass, and, a helicopter pilot if you can help it. Right. And these veterans exist. I'm very fond of the one that lives in my house. But the military is made for you to be Tom Young. So if you're Tom Young, you have a pretty easy time and you do your 20 years and you retire. But every demographic you are away from being that, your job gets harder. And when I was first like toying with the idea of writing my book, it was becoming obvious to me that men didn't understand that my experience in the military was different than theirs, like from day one. And when I had this discussion, it was actually, I had just read Emily Chang's Brotopia, which is about women's experience in tech. And I was like, oh my God, this is like the military. And so I talked about this book very excitedly to 4 different people in a veteran program I was in. And 2 of them were white gentlemen about your age. And they both, like, they just couldn't get it. They couldn't understand the idea that no matter what I did, my experience in the military was ultimately different than a man's experience. And the second or third person I talked to about it, he was a young man. He was studying diversity and inclusion in his degree, and he was trying so hard to get it, but he still just didn't get it. And the fourth man I talked to about it was a black man. And as soon as I said, the concept is just that my experience was different than yours, he kind of paused and cocked his head. I always say when people cock their heads, they're trying to see ideas from a different angle. And he was like, yeah, I get it. Right. Because his experience was also
Right.
ultimately different. And this is something that my Black high school counselor, who put me on the path for college and changed my life, was kind of trying to tell me, in that, like, my experience was not going to be like the posters. It was not going to be like what they were saying. She had a black son who wanted to be a pilot, and he ultimately chose that he would rather go to an HBCU and have the Black college experience than be a black man in a white man's world in the, Air Force Academy and then as a pilot. And I do not blame him.
Right.
You know, it's even so interesting that like one of the things the military does to break you, right, is shave your head. Like everyone knows about this. This is in the textbook definition of degradation ceremonies, what cults are a big fan of. When a young man tells me he's going to the military, I have one piece of advice other than learn to run fast, which is go shave your head 3 weeks before. Because part of it is that shock, right? Most of us haven't
Mm-hmm.
come face to face with our own bald heads, right? They're showing you that they own you so much that they are going to show you a part of your body you haven't seen before. And you should have that moment with yourself. But for women, that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Right? We are not taken and our heads shaved. So from day one in the military, us versus them all the way, your number one job is don't stand out. We stand out from day one. And so here's what's interesting, because people, men, usually try to come back, well, with two things. One, they're like, it's for lice control. And I'm like, oh, please show me all these female resistant lice. I've never heard of them. Yeah, it's not about lice control, and also shaving your head is not a valid way to get rid of lice. I would know after growing up close to Brazilian favelas. We had some like bubonic lice where we would pour
Wow.
kerosene in our hair and they still would not to die.
Wow.
But you know, people say, okay, fine, so shave the women's heads.
Mm-hmm.
Aha, I thought you would say that, right? So here's the next point of view. Well, now you've just othered us in the out group, right?
Mm-hmm.
So now we fit in the military, sure. But when we go outside these walls, we definitely stand out. And
Right.
obviously, oh, and by the way, until 2021, I think it was not an approved appearance for women to have a shaved head. It was considered an extreme hairstyle. This is why if you see the pictures of the first Rangers, you can pick out which ones are the women because their hair is longer, because their hair had to be a quarter of an inch long, whereas the men's is just the Q-tip, they call it. They just basically shave you bald.
Right. And so
So it's not
it's
something that has an easy answer, right? But it is
yeah.
just, you know, I don't think anyone thinks of it from the perspective of the woman. That like from day one,
It
you all go through
right.
this intense bonding experience, and the way that human beings congeal as really, really congealed teams is by going through hard things together.
Mm-hmm.
And we didn't get that. So we are on the outside from day one.
And it's a double bind for women, right? So if the military does treat you like the men, then you are othered on the outside in society. I mean, even today, right? How many times in culture do you see someone ridiculed, a woman, especially for shaving her head? If she has an episode like that, she's immediately labeled as having mental problems or having a breakdown or being quote unquote crazy or losing her mind. So that double bind exists. And because we've all been conditioned for centuries to treat men and women like this and to insist that they behave and that they look a certain way. And when someone deviates from that, then immediately we want to retreat to our binaries. A great example of this is the hoopla at the Olympics over the female boxer or the female Olympian, and I
Yep.
forget her
By
name,
the way,
but
in her off time,
right,
she's a winner of beauty pageants. Like
yeah,
of
there you
all
go.
things
But
ironic.
yeah, but you see posts on social media like, you know, I saw one person saying, well, I don't care what anybody says, you know, she's a dude or whatever, and those kinds of demeaning comments when clearly they don't have any idea what they're talking about, but because we've all been conditioned to retreat to these binaries, when we see something that appears to be a little bit out of the norm, as we've been conditioned to
Yeah.
label normality, we
Right.
label it.
Right. And it's all about putting people in nice, comfortable boxes, right? Which,
Mm-hmm.
by the way, is a juvenile way of thinking. And by juvenile, I mean like 3 and 4-year-olds are at the stage in their thinking where when I had a Halle Berry haircut and I was traveling with my full face of makeup and my earrings, walk over to the bag drop, pick up my army duffel bag, and this little boy, loud as you please, says, "Daddy, is that a girl or a boy?" And, you immediately just see like the, oh, embarrassment, right? Like on the parent's face. But that's what it is, right? And we talked about this in our appearance control episode, but appearance control is always about behavior control. And even for me in my deconstruction, people are like, why are you always knitting? And so many reasons, so many reasons. But I used to have to like break people's hearts with them realizing like I'm not what I look like, so I'm not going to be the box that you put me in. Now I just present myself to the world in such a way that like nobody thinks that the woman dressed all in crochet actively knitting at the cocktail party is going to be a normal conversation. Like nobody expects
Right.
that. So they don't try to put me in their box and I don't have to resist it, and it's just so much easier. But it's, always, every time, it's about behavior control. And this is why, I mean, we had this conversation nationally during the confirmation of KVJ to the Supreme Court, but like any attempt to define what is a woman always gets into policing women. Speaking of shady pants.
Yeah. And you hear that conversation from conservative circles all the time, right? It's a way to demean people who see the nuances in the spectrum of gender, and they level it as an insult. Well, they don't even know what a woman is. But the moment you make that declaration, you are presuming to know what a woman is and how every woman should conform to that particular image that we've been conditioned to believe this is a woman.
Yeah. And this also ties into our skinny white woman episode, so go check that one
Mm-hmm.
out. But this is exactly what I had to realize, right? So I really kind of drank the Kool-Aid of the you have to run faster, jump higher, work harder, and if you do, you will be treated equally, right? And I did, man. I played the game hard like a good cult baby. I estimate that I ran faster than 96% of men that I worked with. There is a great scene in Uncultured about that as well. But like,
Mm-hmm.
first of all, the men on the team didn't have to race 15 other dudes in order to get respect and weren't like broken the next day because of that. But I thought I was proving that women could do this. But if I tell you the number of times I had said directly to me or in front of me, women can't do this. I mean, well, Captain Mestinet can do it, but she's not really a woman.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in a similar way, I can recall growing up as obviously as a young man and being uncomfortable in classes like PE or going to the gym. I never went to the gym. I never participated in any workout programs until I was in my late 40s and early 50s. And one of the reasons why I suspect is because as a young man, I always felt like I would be othered because I couldn't keep up with other men. I've never been all that athletic. I'm not coordinated. And so there was that competitive ranking, right? The alpha male can lift this much, can do that. I never could do those things. And so I missed out on all of the experiences and all of the benefits of physical exercise in a lot of ways because I was conditioned to feel uncomfortable. But now, right, I'm the old guy at the gym, so I don't have to live up, I don't have to compete with the
Yeah.
younger men in the same
Yeah.
way.
It's an incredibly freeing part of deconstruction, I think,
Mhm.
to just realize that you're the adult that makes all the decisions for your own life.
Right.
Today, actually, I was just sitting at my dinner table in a sports bra. I'd made a couple videos in it. And my daughter was like, "Why are you wearing that?" And I said, "Because I want to." Like, The only answer to why I'm wearing something is because I want to. I am the decision maker of my life. And in fact, like, I really recommend people when you're deconstructing, like, wear wacky outfits. There's a parallel for this in the LGBTQ plus community as well. Kind of like the way that the time they go out physically presenting to the world as something that identifies them, where they are on the spectrum, it is this like mind bending kind of moment. And since we are talking about trans and LGBTQ and us versus them, yes, I'm going to get into the Stephen Hassan question and J.K. Rowling. So Stephen Hassan is a cult expert. He calls himself the cult expert. He is a bona fide cult expert. He unfortunately has decided to take the side of J.K. Rowling and the extreme alt-right conversation that trans identity is a cult. And I want to pick that apart a little bit, but I'm going to start by saying, like, we all know J.K. Rowling's is trash. And it is unfortunately my opinion that she wrote a new book under her well-known pseudonym, Robert Galbraith, who I think is the man that invented conversion therapy, by the way. And she wrote a new book about a cult, and she quoted Dr. Stephen Hassan in the book. And so I think a lot of it is just professional ego. But we know for a fact that this language of LGBTQ trans is a cult is coming to us from the alt-right. Right? It's been seeded into the national conversation from the alt-right. The same thing that we like know that AA is a self-sealing system because they all come with the same drinking alcohol is a cult. And I just want to clear this up. For something to be a cult, there is one requirement above all. It has to be a group. Right? So an identity, not a cult. Think about it. Would you say being Black is a cult, or being, as much as I critique straight white men, like, it's not a
Right.
cult. You can have a cult of straight white men. There certainly are LGBTQ cults, but an identity, an idea, this is the same reason I say religions can't be cults. Religions are ideas. Religious groups can be cults. And also an activity can't be a cult. So drinking, used both by cults and non-cults, can be a tool. That thought stopping cliche, I just want to let it limply lie there. But and I'm coming up against this question of, like, what do I do? Like, he's the only one out there who's really done work kind of on MAGA as a cult other than me. And I'm currently quoting him in my book. But now that I think, I don't want to support that anymore, I'm still figuring out what to do there. But it is kind of a little indicative of this thing that we are seeing, which is, a lot of people who did a lot of deconstruction, who even taught us a lot of what we know today about deconstructing and about cults, are kind of getting a little stuck. And a lot of them are now at the point where they don't see that things like MAGA or things like trans identity is a cult, or is not and can't be a cult, because they're just stuck where they landed.
And I fully support everything that you're saying on that issue, but I want to be honest and transparent that as a cisgender white male, 53 years of age, a lot of this, especially in the language, I didn't understand it. I want to understand it more. I want to I want to understand all of the nuances, all of the spectrum, all of the choices that are made. And the bottom line that I come down on with all of these particular issues, the best person to determine their identity, their orientation, their gender is the person that is living in that body and in that skin, perhaps along with their physician, their doctor. And I have no business telling you what your experience is. even though I may not understand it, even though I readily admit that maybe it's, my age or whatever, it's a little hard to keep up with. It seems like the terminology changes a lot. But I want to be respectful and I want to listen. And I want to understand, attempt to understand. But before I can even understand, I have to acknowledge you're the best person to make that determination about identity. And you're
Yeah.
exactly right.
Yeah.
The identity is different than a cult. Absolutely.
Yeah. And, this is the way I tell people too, like, this is the way it's supposed to go, right? Like, I love this thing that there's 3 phases of life: learn, earn, and return.
Mm-hmm.
And when you are in the return phase of your life, which you are, and I am on my way, if not there, we are supposed to look at the structures that we built that help us get to where we are and hope that our children will demolish those structures. I have this analogy. So my husband built an heirloom table. It's made out of a wine barrel. It opens up. It has a drawer for wine bottles and a fridge and this beautiful glass top. And it is lovely. And we absolutely plan to give it to our daughter when she has her first home. We're then not allowed to get mad if she decides that it doesn't work for her anymore. And hey, this big crack right here, like, that's not the centerpiece that I want. Almost a
That's a
la
great
the same
analogy.
thing of
Yeah.
hoping that your daughter will wear your wedding dress.
Mm-hmm.
Well, like, I say this even about parenting. Like, by the time my grandchildren are born, there's going to be hopefully 30 more years of research about how everything I did was wrong. And I just hope that I am open-minded enough to be struggling to keep up with all the new terminology, not the grumpy person sitting in the corner saying kids these days.
Yeah, and I mean, isn't that a better way to live? I mean, that's
Yeah.
just a more optimistic,
Also, it's just
happier way
the
to live.
way it's also just the way of the world. And this is why I
Right.
say, like, conservatives ultimately always lose, because
Hmm.
conservatives are trying to stop change. Like, it's literally called conservative and progressive. Like, change is always going to win, and that's the way it is supposed to go. I love the conversation about GPS, or it's moved on to cursive now. Oh my gosh, we're losing cursive. People are like, no one's going to be able to read a map anymore. Which, by the way, my husband, who is a senior now in college, just had they had a scavenger thing to get to know each other, and he was the only person in a large room that could read a map. But guess what? Like, that none of these kids need to read maps. Your
Right.
teacher that told you weren't always going to have a calculator in your pocket, she wrong. And now, because I don't need to remember all the driving directions in my head, I get to listen to podcasts and I get to, listen to audiobooks and, like, get more information during that time. And this is the same thing I say to people about cursive. Like, the people that need to be able to read cursive, the historians and the artists and the archaeologists, they're going to learn. People still learn ancient Latin and ancient Greek, and everyone else, like, you're not going to need it. But this nostalgia, right? Of, like,
Hmm.
I even think this way back when is another version of us versus them, right? It's like idealized us back in this time when things were better, when in fact, like, no, things get overall better with each generation. Like, that's how it goes.
Right. And maybe it
But
was better. Maybe it was better for you, but it doesn't mean that it was better for everyone. And
isn't that true?
that's that's a wonderful point that you make. Um, we've got a few minutes left, and I want us to touch on. I want you to touch on this family language that is used to cultivate this us versus them. Because growing up
Um,
in my cult, it was a big deal, brother and sister, right?
yes. And then remind me to tell you about the t-shirt too, because that's
Yeah,
important.
absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. So familial language, right? So I say
Hmm.
often on my channels, anything that calls itself your family wants to overwork you, underpay you, and expect you to put up with more bullshit than you would otherwise, as even our families do. right? Like
Right.
that's what family means, right? You're going to work for
Mm-hmm.
them for free. You're going to put up with your crazy, weird uncle, even when you shouldn't. But so, I mean, every time I use numbers about cults, I really have to caveat with like, we know there are no numbers that are actually valid because cults are secretive by nature. But there was at one point, I think we were saying there were 3,000 cults that we know of that use the term the family in their official name. Two
Wow.
of the most famous ones being the family, the children of God, and then the family, the current active cult who runs the National Prayer Breakfast that every president goes to, and that Jeff Charlotte wrote his amazing book and show, The Family, about. But okay, so I say that coercive control tacks very much along a patriarchal model. And in patriarchal model, but also in the US model, right? Family law comes from property law. Um, and it was all about like a lot of familial language is about dehumanizing people, turning them into possessions, separating themselves from all of their other identities, right? We talk about this in the cult of motherhood, where like as soon as you become mom, you're expected to like give up every other identity that is important to you because now you're mom. You don't need anything else for the next 25 years. And it's extremely difficult to do that. It is also very much a cult tactic to use familial language because what they are trying to do is get you to stop thinking as an individual and start thinking as a group member first and foremost. So even in the military, we talk about our groups as family. We also talking about growing up in the military. One of the things I'm
Mm-hmm.
starting to say is if you grew up in a group other than like your country or your city, I have questions. You know, my child is not growing up in anything. Whereas when people say, "Oh, I grew up in the church," you know, we all have
Right.
at least an inkling of what that means. And what it means
Right.
is you probably didn't get the childhood that, you know, most other people around you were getting.
Right.
Um, and this is even one of those things, right? I see so much behind cult mentality is just like the desire to hold yourselves separate, to literally be us versus them. And this is one of the, I think, these new aspects that I'm bringing to cult scholarship, which is like, I'm like, I don't care what you call it. If you grew up in a way that you were being held separate from the majority of the rest of your peers in the society that you were growing up in, you grew up in a high control environment, right? Like
Right.
maybe nobody's ever going to call it a cult, but you had a very similar experience to what I did. And I can just, you know, connect with fellow cult babies so easily because it's like in that language of, yeah, I was held separate and now I spend the rest of my adult life feeling like an other. Because by the way, group norms are not bad, right? All of these things, even stereotypes, right, come to humans because it helps us get along in groups. So, you know, third culture kids, nothing to do with cults, have this struggle. When you grow up in a culture that is not your home culture, you kind of miss what is supposed to happen during your, you know, middle school, high school years, which is you act out, you get pushback, right? Whether that's
Mm-hmm.
from parents, friends, peers, teachers, and you learn how to act. This is
Right.
why we all know that like homeschooled adults are their own category, right? Because we didn't learn how to act. There's also a term called delayed adolescence that a lot of us experience when we leave cults
Mm-hmm.
because our world was so black and white, right? Like that's the
Yeah.
purpose of a high control environment is it gives you this framework, usually breaks down into thousands of little rules, and gives you this framework. And this is why it's also so scary and so hard to deconstruct. I think it's one of the reasons that we go cult hopping. It's like, we're like, okay, that was bad, but
Right.
I need a new framework for how to live
Yep.
my life. And one of the things I say to people is you can do anything without a framework. It's just harder.
And that is so helpful because I know that's something that I have experienced. That's something that I continue to experience, looking for community, looking for frameworks. But you're exactly right. It takes that effort and that determination to say, you know what, that's what I was, and that's where I was limited. So now a whole new world is opening up to me. But you're still going to deal with those particular feelings of being an outsider, of being othered, because you're entering a whole new experience that was denied you because of the cult or the high
Yeah.
control
Yeah.
group that you were a part of.
And so, one of my deconstruction tips to people is just to say, like, if you grew up in a high control group, whether that is a cult, a church, a narcissistic family, a place where you had justified lying and different things that insiders knew and outsiders knew, like, you didn't grow up in the culture that you're in. That's why you feel so uncomfortable. And for me and my husband, it has been really helpful to look at it as like, we are in a cross-cultural marriage.
Yeah.
Because that's really the truth. Okay, so I'm going to tell you about my shirt. So
Yes, please.
for us versus them mentality, I always try to wear a sassy shirt that matches. And so I wore my Guardians, which is what the Space Force called themselves. And yes, I mean
Nice.
as in of the galaxy. So, a lot of people don't know this. They just call everything soldiers except Marines. But the Army, if you're in the Army, you're a soldier. If you're in the Navy, you're a seaman, even if you're a woman. If you're in the Air Force, you're an airman, even if you're a woman. And if you're in the Marines, you're a Marine. And so when the Space Force was created by our cult leader president, cults always promise you space travel, they chose to call themselves the Guardians. So someone sent this to me because it was so funny. By the way, the chapter of this Us versus Them chapter that I'm writing, the title is We Are the Best, Down with All the Rest. Right? Because it is that
Hmm.
mentality. And I talk in my book, I was going to read it, but I'm not, about how they teach us that in the military. While we are marching and chanting and lulling ourselves into a state of susceptibility, we are doing us versus them chants against the other platoons, against the other squads, against the whatever. A lot of them are also very rapey, so against the women. But,
Hmm.
it's like, I immediately put on this shirt and I want to be like, oh my God, the Space Force. Like, come on, there are no cardinal directions in space. Your motto is going to be protecting us from above. Really? Or anyone mentions the Marines and the rest of us will talk about eating crayons. Marines being so dumb they eat crayons. That's a thing.
Yeah.
If you're in the Air Force, we call you the Chair Force, except they earned all of my respect with the evacuation of Afghanistan. And it's like good natured ish,
Hmm.
but I was once, I have to think about how much of this I can talk about. I was once part of a get ready mission that now exists for all of the branches in case of a need to evacuate American citizens. And because it happened once in Lebanon in 2006, which is when we found out, trying to evacuate 400,000 people, that all of the branches don't speak the same language. So we couldn't communicate. This was a similar thing. My husband was in the 160th, which is the special operations helicopter unit that was created after the Iran hostage crisis went so wrong. And they realized the
Yeah.
special operators on the ground and the people flying the helicopters don't know how to communicate because they don't have the same language, because it is so much us versus them built in. And finally, I just think this is like, there's a reason that President Obama spent his valuable time in his last address in office talking about the danger of silos, right? Being in our
Hmm.
silos, we're isolated. We talked about this on the last episode, but like almost as soon as we define an us, we define a them. Right? I always say it gets dangerous when you name them, right? We called you the systemites. And
Yeah.
them becomes the enemy. You know, and I say this, I think, in Uncultured, where I'm like, as women, we are othered. Very quickly in high control groups, the other becomes the enemy. And in the army, our doctrinal mission is to find, fix, and finish the enemy. And really wrapping it in, since I'm on my soapbox, like, this is why I truly believe that being part of taking down the combat ban made the military safer for women. You know, our number one predator in the military is men in the military. And, you know, what militaries are is individuals trained to conduct violence on behalf of state, right? When we really boil it down. So you take a group of people that has been trained to use violence, and then you tell them that 10 to 20% of their counterparts aren't as good as them. Like, it's easily predictable. In fact, I think to the point of negligence on behalf of these generals, that it is going to end in violence and rape and often murder.
Yeah, and that's a powerful point. You know, it's a very short distance from someone being the other to someone becoming the enemy. And this has been a great conversation. And I want to just encourage all of our listeners and all of our viewers, if you want to know more about this subject, first of all, start with Daniella's book, pick up Uncultured and read it. Go in particular to the chapter "Us versus Them" mentality. It's all great. It's an incredible story, very well written, and you'll be glad that you picked up that book. Follow Daniella on her Patreon page, on the social media, the Knitting Cult Lady. It's a great tag, and it's a great way to follow her.
And also the chapter Drink the Kool-Aid, which is my chapter on basic
Yeah.
training, where I'm really talking about how they like inculcate this in for us. By the way, Scott, I've been meaning to tell you, we've had 1,000 downloads on our podcast now.
Fantastic.
And that's not counting any of the video stuff like on my YouTube, etc. But everybody, thank you so much. And if you're listening to us on a podcast, please rate and give us a 5-star rating and review. You don't have to write anything. But these ratings are really important to making it more easily searchable. Also, if you liked this podcast, check out my other podcast, Hey White Woman, where White Woman Whisperer, a Black creator, and I are deconstructing white supremacy like the cult that it is. Scott, as ever, thanks for being such a wonderful conversation partner, and looking forward to next time.
Absolutely. And we'll see you all on the next episode of Cults and the Culting of America. Nice job.
I'm worried my computer's going to die.